If you think everything that God has promised you is going to happen in 2025, you're setting yourself up for failure. Now, give me a second to explain. I'm by no means saying that God isn't going to accomplish what he set out to do, but I am saying that oftentimes as a Christian, we have the wrong expectation of the pace to the promise. So what ends up happening is we go through the year sprinting, and at the end of it, when we didn't get the opportunity that we thought we were going to get, or we didn't meet our future spouse that we thought we were going to meet, or you didn't get that job that you were praying for, all of a sudden we think that something is wrong. But let me tell you that oftentimes a promise of God is going to be developed in one season and then harvested in another. And one of the clearest examples of this is actually the beginning of the church. Now, we're going to go through some numbers, but just bear with me because this truth is going to unlock your understanding of how God works. Did you know that after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension to heaven, there is an estimated 1,000 Christians on earth? And we know historically that after 300 years, it had blown up into 30 million Christians. And when I say that, that'll make sense to you because we always envisioned the beginning church as this revival movement that blew up and everybody was getting saved and everybody was getting converted, and there was a move of God and the Spirit of God was just spreading out across the world. But here is something that nobody talks about in this story. So the church started in the year 40 with 1,000 members, and then 300 years later, it was at 30 million. So why don't you take a guess at where the church was at after the first decade, 10 years? Before, I would have guessed, 10 million, 500,000, 100,000 even. But according to historical research, the church grew by 40% every single decade, which means that after 10 years, the church went from 1,000 to 1,400. That's only adding 40 people a year. Imagine being a disciple, an apostle, and Jesus gives you the Great Commission, go out across all the nations and make disciples, and then after 1 year, you've added only 40 people. I imagine there was a level of skepticism. I imagine there was a level of doubt among some Christians. They probably were looking around saying, I thought that this was going to look a lot different. But where they didn't necessarily see growth, they saw preparation. See, what was happening during this time of the early decades of the church was Paul was writing letters to the church. Peter was writing letters to the church. There was organization and structure and foundations that were being built. So when the huge numbers started pouring in eventually 100 years later, 200 years later, the disciples in the church were actually ready for the harvest. So this year, God may have spoken some things into your heart, into your spirit, goals, dreams, visions. Let me just encourage you to trust his pace. Don't be focused on trivial things that you can quantify, like numbers of followers or a job or finances. Just learn how to fall in love with faithfulness. Imagine if people got so discouraged by the number 40 after a year that all of a sudden they quit. And there was no church that was built, and there was no movement of God because they could only judge things based off of what they saw. When I started this podcast and this YouTube channel, I had about 3 views and downloads every single week, and that was 1 from my wife, 1 from my mom, and sometimes my mom watched it and listened to it twice. But I fell in love with faithfulness. I fell in love with obedience, and over time, when God decided to bring the harvest, I was able to steward it. So in 2025, with what God has spoken over your life, work to get ready for the harvest whenever God decides to bring it.